The stories that we're given, the mass media is one story, and if you disagree with it, you're automatically considered to be a conspiracy theorist. So you're already a theorist. So they assume the authority of objectivity, like they're actually considered to be objective by a lot of people, and that's probably the major disconnect that we have collectively, is that people think that the reporters are out there trying to get the story to tell you, like they're speaking truth to power and they're trying to give you a better concept of what's going on in the world. But no, I'm saying their primary objective is a worldview formation. We've been talking lately about the book Propaganda, Edward Bernays. And Edward Bernays, father of public relations, which is all about shaping how the public sees things, he's a descendant, he's the great uncle of the founder of Netflix. And how often have we talked about Netflix and how everything on there happens the year after? The predictive programming in Netflix is insane. I mean, you can find examples. If you had watched everything on Netflix 2019, you would have been ready for 2020. Pandemic, all the different terms that you had to learn that you may not have been familiar with before, you would have learned on this 5-part documentary called Pandemic right before lockdown started. And besides, I mean, even after this, Netflix was one of the first companies to shut down because one of their workers caught the virus. So they integrate perfectly with the news. And Bernays, of course, is also related to Freud. Just another one of these interesting connections. So what I'm getting at here is that media has always been tightly controlled. It's always been a reality shaping mechanism. It's never been there to report the news or inform you. It's been there to conform your mind and to get you filtered through their screen. And people have made this correlation between the screen and Kubrick's monolith. And I think that's a perfect correlate. I think it makes sense. I think that's actually it. I think that the concept of a monolithic worldview shaping mechanism, as expressed by the censored television, is exactly what Kubrick was conveying with 2001: A Space Odyssey back in '68. And moreover, the protagonist eventually merges with this thing. And I kind of think that's where we're at. That if you've given in to all the mind control, and if you've ceased asking questions, and you automatically think that anybody who distrusts the news is a crazy conspiracy theorist and a threat to your survival, well, you're on the other side of your screen. You're inside of your smartphone, basically. Your perceptions of the outside world are secondary to what you get through the screen. You're looking through the glass like Alice in Wonderland. And that's where they want people. So that's where people are. That's our starting point. So let's go ahead and get it. So given that, starting with the idea that we have this centralized control over media, the next thing is, you can alter the past. You can memory hold things. You can rewrite things. That's constantly happening. The reason they don't want you questioning the news is because that news becomes history. And they don't like you messing with their history. So they nip it in the bud. Oh, that guy's calling that news article a hoax. Censor him, because we need that to stick around so we can put it in the textbooks and program the youth with that's the version of events that happened. Think about it. The official version of everything will go in the history books. So they control the past, we understand that, but the way they control the future is both through controlling the present, as they do by telling us what's happening, by showing us what they want us to believe, but they control our future through news bending. Look up Newsbenders, 1968, a play. It's a play about an individual getting invited to work at a news company, and he's let in on the secret that they planned their news decades in advance. Well, I don't know if they went that far. Maybe that was, but I go that far. I'm suggesting 100 years in advance. And that when you're looking at movies that seem to come true later, when you look at science fiction books where they're prophetic, yeah, it's because it's a story that's unfolding in front of us. And that's why I call it the meta script, because it ties in entertainment. It ties in all of the tightly controlled culture, and it, everything from comic books to video games to the movies, and then of course the novels are huge. Predictive programming in the novels is big. They control your imagination, and then the meta scripters integrate all of this fiction into what you're given on the news. So you drill it in your head. You go through stuff before you actually experience it in, quote, reality. I mean, very few, I doubt any of you here were witnesses to 9/11. But you witnessed 9/11 through the news vicariously. But you had already experienced total devastation and these types of dramatic attacks like they try to sell us on 9/11 in the movies in advance. And my contention is that they, as in the meta scripters, the ones who are behind the monolith, they're very good at setting your expectations and even programming you. And I think this is the MK Ultra. This is the mind control programming, the worldview warfare. It's waged through, I think, directly telling everybody to their subconscious and directly, essentially downloading into your mind all of the various scenarios you'll be facing in the future so you can just be predicted. They can count on you to respond in a very specific way. You know, I'm reminded of Independence Day. After the movie Independence Day came out, if you remember that movie, it's just I couldn't understand how they put a happy ending on a movie that wipes out most of the world. But anyway, the story just has alien invaders, buildings blowing up. Suddenly the president saves the world. He becomes this hero. And it was a movie that was referenced after 9/11. People said the building's falling. It was like Independence Day. So these associations, you know, obviously you're going to reach for something, but I'm saying that these are intentionally planted. And beyond just the imagery, it goes deeper into the subtext of the stories, as you'll see. So let's go ahead and start going through. So Kubrick is the key here. He's one of the keys, and we don't have to start in any particular spot on this, but what I'm eventually getting to is my theory that this QAnon phenomenon was probably created in the 60s and has the same authors as 9/11. So let me go ahead and play this first, because this will kind of set the stage a little bit for what comes next. So this is from World Wrestling Entertainment, and most of you have seen this, but these are clips that if you're just a consumer of television, you would come across stuff like this. Somebody in your family would have seen this, and you may not have recognized the importance of it or significance at the time, but in retrospect, it's hard to deny.
This would be at this time the Slickster, a key in the African dream and a big boss man. Gentlemen, is this the match you wanted all along, or are you going to continue your terrorist attacks?
Okay, so these guys are called the Twin Towers, and they're being asked about the terrorist attacks. And then you have another scene where Hulk Hogan and Randy, the Macho Man Savage, talk about demolishing the Twin Towers.
All right, thank you, Vince McMahon. Hulk Hogan, Macho Man Randy Savage, the lovely Elizabeth. Three people working as one with one goal in mind: to defeat, or should I say demolish, the Twin Towers. Yeah. Hulk Hogan, you talked about the
Okay, so demolishing the Twin Towers, you've probably heard this, but this is the type of thing that people are often pointing to when they say predictive programming. And I think it's helpful to look at that in context when I'm going to assert that an individual like Stanley Kubrick was involved as an architect in how 9/11 happened, not only directing that psyop, but many, many others. In fact, he's been connected with they tell on themselves, by the way. That's how a lot of people have arrived at, like, wait a minute here. What are these strange connections with Kubrick and Apollo 11? But if you follow that line of thinking and you analyze all his films that way, as has been done by many, you begin to see, you got to look at the work of Jay Weidner and chartword.com and others. You can see that no, it's not limited to Apollo 11. It wasn't some guy guilt tripping that he did some job for the government. He wanted to tell the truthers. No, it's much, much deeper and probably more insidious than that. Because what you find is that all of his movies tend to hint at things, tell things in ways that are beyond coincidence. So let's just go ahead and start here. And eventually you're going to see how this works its way to QAnon, to Trump, and to the Kennedys, and this Camelot mythos, the idea of this returning king, a little bit of Macbeth, and it goes back, this symbolic language, Freemasonic sorcery, ritualistic sacrifices of sun kings. Very interesting material, but let's start with this one. the connections between 2001: A Space Odyssey and the 9/11 attacks. And then, of course, let me bring this up. Yesterday was July 16th. That was the anniversary of the death of JFK Jr. So listen to this. Kubrick's sudden death was suspicious, but not for the reasons commonly cited. Like the deaths of JFK and JFK Jr., which were most likely hoaxes directed by Kubrick and then later revealed in his movies, it's extremely likely that Kubrick's death was faked, so he could devote his full attention to directing the 9/11 hoax, which was the biggest staged event since D-Day. So this is from chartword.com, and he brings up the Kennedys, and this is where I wanted to start, because whether or not they're correct in this or whether or not they're being played, the fact is QAnoners believe that they're basically in on a revenge plot, and that JFK Jr. is going to avenge his father's death, and that the plan to defeat the deep state is actually his plan, and that Trump is one of his agents, or that he's working with Trump. So there's this connection with Kubrick and the JFK story that I want to highlight first. But let me go ahead and gloss over this article just to give you some familiar points here if you haven't seen any of this. So for one, you have a scene where Danny is in the tricycle in The Shining, going down the hotel room hallway, and he sees the twins. And there are some things here that diverge from the book that actually underscore all of the points I'm making here. Like the fact that they're twins here, identical twins for the movie, that wasn't part of the book. So he makes them twins. Danny's going down the hall, and he has a vision of them dead, bloodied on the ground with wounds in the middle. Like twin, it's gruesome. Another scene, he's throwing darts, and they walk in the room. And this is highlighting the projectile nature of the attack, the planes. And the twins, again, make an appearance adjacent to a phone booth, a Bell phone booth. So if you look at Ground Zero, you have a Bell telephone tower adjacent to the Twin Towers. Again, the darts. What's more, at Ground Zero, there's another Kubrick reference. At the 9/11 site stands a hotel that was designed to resemble the 2001 monolith. This is known as the Millennium Hilton. So this is already there. This is just showing you that there's multiple events that he seems to be connected to, and these are all overlapping. And it even kind of goes forward into the future, and I think it relates a lot to his Eyes Wide Shut and the primary actor there, Tom Cruise, who happens to be going to the space station. I think it's going to be in September, if not sooner, but Tom Cruise is about to go to the space station to film the first movie in space. And his relationship with Kubrick, it's not only just he worked in a movie where Kubrick was the director. No, he's actually integrated into this script that started back in the 60s, if not further back. He's playing a role on the world stage. That's my contention. And there are many individuals we discuss who appear to be total constructs. And what gives away a lot of Kubrick's involvement in these events are the images, the scenes, various very iconic scenes. So one of the most iconic images of the 9/11 hoax is the Flight 175 speeding to the South Tower. And it looks exactly like the space plane. Whoever heard of a space plane? Approaching the twin wheels of a space station. Now on 7/11, about almost a week ago, Richard Branson actually took a space plane to almost space. And it was on the 42nd anniversary of Skylab's fall. But this image here is pretty unmistakable. So what is happening is that these images are being put out there first, and then you see them later. So you're able to use predictive programming both as a way to reverse engineer and see how you got there, but also it's something of a predictive model. That's how we were able to ascertain certain things about, for example, sky fall, space junk falling, things that we've predicted. For example, it was back in, I think it was the 10th, no, on the 9th. The 9th of March, 2020, we had a live stream that said World War III begins on Wednesday, because there are so many different references in movies, predictive programming, that kept on pointing out 3/11 as the starting of World War III. Ground Zero Seattle. China being involved. Like, these were the reoccurring themes that we were discussing for months. And sure enough, 3/11, Ground Zero, pandemic in Seattle. So there's a consistency here to the story. And what we're trying to do here, I think what we have done actually, is we have caught onto certain threads that have not yet entirely unfolded. So it's a really interesting time to be alive, if you ask me, especially because of what's supposed to happen now. And that's kind of why I'm doing this, because this QAnon story, as annoying as it is, it doesn't go away, and it's being used in various ways, mainly to demonize free speech. But I think that might be part of it as well. So let's go ahead and continue a little bit here. The plot of Kubrick's black comedy, Dr. Strangelove, revolves around a plane on a low-level attack mission. So this is very reminiscent of Flight 77 at treetop height, going for the Pentagon. And this scene here was from a movie that was screened on 11/22/63. So 11/22/63 is the death date of JFK. So interestingly enough, yesterday, as I said, was 7/16/1999. 7/16 is the anniversary of JFK Jr.'s death. So wait a minute here. So on JFK's death day, Dr. Strangelove was screening. On JFK Jr.'s death day, Eyes Wide Shut was released, his final movie. So I don't think that these are coincidences. And again, there's a bigger pattern here. In fact, you know, Kubrick's film Full Metal Jacket ties into his involvement in the JFK assassination, specifically depicting Oswald, hinting at Oswald and JFK in that movie. But also, that movie's release date was 9/11 in the United Kingdom. And this is, again, the dates of the releases of these things are very, very important. So again, 7/16, significant date. Just past that one is the 22nd anniversary of JFK Jr.'s death. So the idea here is that we're looking at a family that had been used to create something of a mythos. So let's move on back to the script here. I'm going to scroll down a few more points. A few more points here. Okay, one, so Kubrick, I think, is very important. I don't think that he's the mastermind. I think that we're looking at a think tank, a group. In fact, I could list a number of individuals who are very prominent in this metascript. Individuals like Alan Moore, Christopher Nolan, Tom Clancy, I guess Spike Lee recently, with a lot of the cops killing unarmed individuals. I think that what we can find is that there are many, and it's revealed in the predictive programming. You know, people ask, well, who's doing this? Who's doing this? How is it happening across? Like, I first started noticing esoteric symbolism in movies that wasn't meant for that isn't meant at all for the ticket buyer, clearly, because it has nothing to do with the plot. But I first started noticing it with the Jim Carrey movies, and specifically The Truman Show. And it's not really hard to take that apart once you know the significance of the dog star. But then you find, if you look, that the rest of his movies all contain similar bits of symbolism. A lot of 9/11, 3/11 stuff in so many of these popular movies for a reason. We're talking about, again, a centralized directing. This is what the monolith really stands for. And I would imagine that Kubrick is actually, again, one of the main, I would say, visionaries for the major league psyops of the last century. I mean, since the 60s, since Kennedy's assassination, if that was where he started. I mean, I don't know how far back this goes, but we also, again, we're looking at this also as relating to the space program, and he's the individual who's credited with helping to, well, falsify a lunar landing. Now, the depths of the symbolism speaks for itself. It's so integrated, and it's so in-depth, and it overlaps in so many different movies. It's a language that we're discerning. And this also explains something else. Shortly after 9/11, somebody figured out that your $20 bill could be folded to look like the Twin Towers. So when you get into this, and again, timing is everything. Dates, time, these things are ritualistic and precise. So 9/11 starts at 8:46 a.m. The George Floyd event has the 846 tied into it because he was asphyxiated for 846. I know they changed it recently, but they went with 846 for a reason, for a year. There are many things we could point to with that number alone, but that's your most prominent 9/11 connection. But now let's show how it's not just connecting dots. There are celestial alignments. Like Mercury was rising at 8:46 a.m., 9/11/2001. The sun set at 8:46 p.m. in the Twin Cities the day Floyd was killed. George Floyd was basically arrested, or he was going to be arrested over what? A counterfeit $20 bill. Another 9/11 reference, Twin Cities, and many, many more references. But my point being, the only way that you could explain, and it's not just the $20 bill, the $100 bill actually pertains quite a lot to the pandemic and the coming EMP blackout. So that's kind of a future thing that we've kind of picked up on, and we'll see. My point is, the only way this could make sense is if you're looking at this as a prop in a bigger story. And that's exactly what my contention here is. So I'm starting off here, just getting into the involvement of Stanley Kubrick in 9/11, Apollo 11, the JFK assassination. Those are the also the George Floyd event. In fact, 2001 Space Odyssey has a very prominent corona at the beginning, right above the monolith. And it goes to a scene where the world leaders are gathered around, closed door meeting, and the individual named Floyd is talking about the cover story of the epidemic. So you have Floyd, you have epidemic, you have corona, and this is all in Space Odyssey 2001. Those are some of the primary links, but again, foreshadowing, and it goes through all of Kubrick's films, and it suggests also, again, we're looking at long-term planning. So now this is where it gets interesting to me, is that let me find this separate article by Chartword where he has actually figured out that the movie Eyes Wide Shut is actually a reference to JFK Jr., that Tom Cruise's character. So here's the article, Eyes Wide Shut, Stanley Kubrick and the JFK Jr. death hoax. Simple Question says, Pink Floyd, Breathe. Oh, interesting. Oh yeah, the word magic. I mean, what else can you call it? The anagrams that tell the story. It's just, it goes so deep. In fact, there are, well, I'll go through all of it here. But there are indicators here that Kubrick was obviously faking his death because his own obituary actually works its way into this movie where, one, he died 3 days before it was released, and two, it came out on the 30th anniversary of Apollo 11, the date that Apollo 11 took off. So there's another, and it took off from where? Kennedy Space Center. So you got 7/16, release date, Eyes Wide Shut, death date, JFK Jr., Kennedy takes off, or rather the Apollo takes off from Kennedy. Okay, so July 16th, 1969, Apollo 11, first mission to land astronauts on the moon is launched from Kennedy at Cape Kennedy, Florida. July 16th, 1999, John F. Kennedy Jr. dies when his plane crashes into the Atlantic. Now, I've looked into this story in depth, and I have a lot of material on this, and we could go into that next. But the early accounts involved something shooting him down. July 16, 1999, Eyes Wide Shut opens in the United States. So this article goes deep into Eyes Wide Shut and how it could easily be referencing JFK Jr. And I think it goes also, I think that this story, this meta script and this narrative, I think it even goes through the 2001 movie starring Tom Cruise, directed by Cameron Crowe, Vanilla Sky, where he goes into his real life after a simulated death or a fake death. It's one of these movies where there's a subtext where it kind of could tell the same story. But let's stick with this one for the moment here. So Kubrick, Kennedy, the connection. Jay Weidner showed us in the movie The Shining that Kubrick was giving a veiled confession of his involvement in the staging of the Apollo moon landings. President Kennedy actually created the Apollo program. It's a very important point. JFK is represented in The Shining by the hotel manager Stuart Ullman. So The Shining has the character that represents JFK right there in your face. Sleepy Random has joined us in the chat. Thanks for joining. Says live or Mandela affected. Yeah, this is indeed live. Let me just go ahead and let everybody know what we're working on. We're working on a mind map to chart out the connections, rather well, there are many connections, but I want to stick to the storyline, the connection between Kubrick, JFK, and QAnon. So I'm going into some background material here, and then we'll work our way forward into the future and the QAnon movement and what they believe JFK Jr. Represents. And also we'll go into the death of JFK, the King Kill 33 analysis, where the symbolic breakdown of it shows that we're looking at, I think, a story of a mythologized family. And it's templated off of Camelot and Macbeth, among other things, which we'll get to. Kevin Mooring says, could they use a hologram to make people think that JFK Jr. is alive? You know, they could just hire an actor. They may already have, and we'll get to that. Okay, so let's go on. Next, in Full Metal Jacket, says here, Kubrick's veiled confession of his involvement of the President Kennedy assassination hoax. JFK started the Vietnam War. He's represented in Full Metal Jacket by Private Joker. Again, there's a pattern here, and the pattern is basically telling stories, but having these replacement characters. And the names of the characters give away almost everything. So 1980, Kubrick used his movie The Shining to reveal information involving the Kennedy family and the Apollo program that he could not disclose publicly. The 87 Kubrick film Full Metal Jacket, again, came out 9/11 in the UK, revealed information involving the Kennedy family and the assassination that he could not disclose. And then finally, July 16th, on the same day JFK Jr. was killed, he releases Eyes Wide Shut. What are the odds? Kubrick used the movie Eyes Wide Shut to reveal information involving the Kennedy family and a plane crash near Cape Cod. So if there's an MO here and a pattern, then yes, it would follow that the movie Eyes Wide Shut would be disclosing something about this particular event. So JFK Jr. was a lawyer, magazine publisher who lived in New York. He was the only son of President JFK. The main character in Eyes Wide Shut, Dr. Bill Harford, also lives in New York City. Goes on to talk about the role of the New York Post. It says the New York Post played a big role in this death hoax, and the day after the plane crash, they ran a front page column claiming that JFK Jr. didn't want to fly. So they created a narrative that this was an ill-fated flight. He was married to Carolyn Bessette, and then, of course, the comparison here is being made with Nicole Kidman. Bill Harford, doctor, is married to Alice Harford, a statuesque beauty who worked at an art gallery, who was a recreational drug user. And it says here, Carolyn Bessette was a recreational drug user and a statuesque beauty who worked in the fashion industry. And of course, if you watch Eyes Wide Shut, Nicole Kidman is a pot smoker. Both JFK Jr. and Tom Cruise were sexiest man alive, according to People magazine. Again, Metascript. You're looking at entertainment and world stage actors kind of merging together, not unintentional. I'm going to move on here. Okay. Now, there's a few other things here. It describes here how JFK Jr. was characterized as being reckless, and that caused the crash. And reckless would be the way you would describe the character in Eyes Wide Shut. In the movie, there are references to Cape Cod. So the character that represents JFK Jr.'s wife, Carolyn, that character, Nicole Kidman, specifically mentions Cape Cod. So do you remember last summer at Cape Cod? So very conspicuous reference. And then there are characters in here who apparently overlap with others, like real life characters. Let me move on. It seems to be another example, though. Again, it's about the MO, and what I'm establishing here is that pattern here, that there's a methodology here. We talked about the 9/11 predictive programming with the, and this is interesting too, because it's with the World Wrestling Federation. So the consistency here between all the symbolism across all these different outlets, that's what's becoming the most interesting thing about this, because it shows you how monolithic it really is. So let's go ahead and go back now to JFK himself and his death. So King Kill 33 is an essay. This essay went out of print for some time, and it got republished in the late 80s, but it's by James Shelby Downard. And what he came up with was the analysis that involved taking into account ritualistic symbolism. So here's where it starts. What Downard thinks, he believes that he's seeing some occult secret society staging a very sadistic murder, an assassination, a headshot in front of his wife and in front of the world. My contention is that we're looking at theater, and that this was basically a film. So this guy James Downard apparently didn't know that, and he wouldn't have had a way. It's kind of like before 2012, how would any of you would have known about the existence of crisis actors? You wouldn't have. So therefore, all of your assessments about the bad news would have included a higher body count than there actually is. So I'm just pointing that out because we're kind of fortunate that we're not stuck with any false starting points. Okay, so it says here, King Kill 33, the Masonic symbolism in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. The information I present on these pages on the assassination of Kennedy are well known to certain news agencies who suppress it. The motivation for the assassination has been plunged into cryonic secrecy. It says here, the archetypes of fertility and death symbolism seemingly are motivated to bring about syncretism in opposing opposites, to bring about, in short, the one world government. He says, Masonic sorcery, the union of opposite principles, will bring this about. The criminals who staged the Dallas killings have controlled the American people's will. Most Freemasons have no idea of the evil that is part of Masonry. So he goes on about Freemasonry and the science of what he calls the science of names. He says, the science of names, word wizardry, forms one segment of the symbolism used by the Masons. The JFK assassinations encounters this in a decisive way, and it contains a nightmare of symbol complexes having to do with violence, conspiracy, and death. These elements are important not only in cause and effect, but in the ensuing reaction of the American people. So he's talking about a psyop. It's meant to create a response, but he's suggesting that they're tapping into very primal fears. He says the killing of the king right and its death and fertility symbolism is part of the greening ritualism that has to do with JFK. And it's been suppressed because it would link it to Freemasonry and the political influence it exerts. So he talks about the study of places imbued with sorcerous significance, including lines of latitude and longitude. So part of the story of the JFK assassination has to do with where it happened, 33rd parallel, and the names of the places around it. Again, he breaks down the story as we do almost every one of these major psyops. One of the most interesting ones recently, a couple years ago, was the death of Nipsey Hussle. There on the 33rd parallel at the Marathon store in Crenshaw, where it's like designed to look like a modern recreation of the death of Christ in a certain way. He carries a son named Cross. He's killed between two thieves, two convicts. The people describe him as Jesus. His friends call him Jesus. Snoop Dogg says, hey, look, he's 33 and he looks like Jesus. he was Jesus, literally. I mean, they tell these stories all the time. And by all the evidence available, the guy's not dead. It's just staged. And I'm suggesting that we're looking here at another one of these killing of the king rites. So we're looking at the same type of ritual, and it breaks down and it has all the same symbols, thus the number 33. And again, the names of places, as most of you know who follow any of these psychological operations, it has everything to do with it. Ritual props. Okay, so now here's where it goes into the killing of the king ritual. It says, the eternal pagan psychodrama escalates under the modern conditions because sorcery is not what the 20th century man can accept as real. Oh, by the way, 11/22/63, this is another thing. So there are connections, as I pointed out, between 9/11 and the Derek Chauvin George Floyd event. There's connections between both those events and the Rodney King beating. This is why I'm kind of pointing out here we're looking at a very well integrated script. Well, the Derek Chauvin character, if you notice, they use these numbers and dates very, very intentionally to communicate things. Like, so for example, he had a hearing on 9/11/2020. Why would you have Derek Chauvin in an event that was already encoded all kinds with 9/11 from the 846 Twin Cities on? Why would he be in court on 9/11 if not to infuriate people? Because on that date, for the last 19 years, Americans had used that date to go outside of their homes at 8:46 a.m. to wave their American flags. Now, there's a ritual for you. 8:46, the time that the tower was hit. They're out there waving their flags. Well, on that date, Derek Chauvin's on trial. Benjamin Crump, his attorney, and the entire Floyd family are out in front wearing masks with 8:46 on them. So to me, there's just something perverse about that, about the way people are being played. But moreover, when they finally let him out before he went to trial, he was released from Hennepin County Sheriff's Department at 11/22. So 1122, that date, it has to do with, of course, Lee Harvey Oswald. And if you look at the mugshots of the day, they did pretty well creating a Oswald type look on the face of Derek Chauvin that day. Not a coincidence. Not a coincidence that the death of Daunte Wright occurred down the street from where George Floyd was killed. This was just a couple months ago. Not a coincidence. It was on 63rd Street. And his teacher was George Floyd's girlfriend. My point being, we're seeing interrelated events that shouldn't be connected, but there are instances here where it's given away in the numerology. And that's the reason why we're mapping it out, because without that, it would be impossible to convey it. But let me go ahead and go on. He says, the ultimate purpose of the assassination wasn't political or economic, but sorcerous, for control of the dreaming mind and the marshaling of its forces. So this makes sense to me. Control of the dreaming mind, the unconscious, controlling people at a level that they can't control themselves. Like, it's just reaching deep. They set the premise. This is just the essence of mind control. But he's trying to figure out, well, what's the purpose of this and why all the ritual trappings. And again, when you go through here, he says the importance of Dealey Plaza. He says this was planned by the New Orleans CIA station, whose headquarters were a Masonic temple building. Dallas, Texas is 10 miles north of 33 latitude. 33 degrees is the highest in Freemasonry. The founding lodge of the Scottish Rite was in Charleston, South Carolina on the 33rd. Now there is quite a lot here. He even shows you how the stories matched up pretty well with the Masonic killing of Hiram Abiff, that this is a killing of the king ritual. He does a lot to establish this. He says the systematic arrangement and patterns of symbolic things having to do with the killing of Kennedy indicates that he was a scapegoat and a sacrifice. The purpose of such macabre ritualism is recognizable in patterns of symbolism culminating in this making manifest of all that is hidden. Now, he gets into the Wizard of Oz a little bit here. Says, one should note the significance of Jack Ruby destroying Oswald in reference to the ruby slippers and the Wizard of Oz. You may deride this as a fairy tale, but which nevertheless symbolizes the immense power of... Now, let me stop here for a second. Wizard of Oz. So whenever you look at this predictive programming, you'll notice it's coming from things that everybody sees. And that's one of the reasons why it would probably draw from something popular. But this shows you how far back these symbolic stories have been used and how useful they are, obviously for conveying these ritualistic scripts. But let me go ahead and bring up a couple of things, because the Wizard of Oz was the subject of a conversation today. We were talking about the group The Coup, their album Party Music. And my interpretation of it is this. The Coup Party Music album cover has the Twin Towers being remotely detonated with bombs. This album came out on September the 11th. It's got the red star, so obviously, Communist Party music. So coup is a really important term overall here, because that's what we're looking at, as you'll see, the bigger picture. And, ultimately, the JFK Jr. story is revenge for what is being interpreted in this storyline as a coup by the deep state by taking out Kennedy. Now, this is all mythology, but that is what the world lives in. We live in a world of people who believe in myths. So this same group, though, they have a song called, and I'm not going to play it. I personally think it's horrible. We Got the Guillotine. And maybe it wasn't horrible when it came out, but Antifa certainly ruined it last year, because they were singing the song last year. Now, the significance is 9/11, New York. That was the ground zero. The ground zero for the pandemic, 3/11, was Seattle. Now, we have many, many examples of this Seattle predictive programming. In fact, on Netflix, there's a show called Colony, where episode 11 of season 3, the character says Seattle is ground zero for the reboot of civilization. Well, they're using COVID for the reset. Seattle was ground zero, 3/11/2020. Well, anyway, Seattle's known as the Emerald City. So the same group whose album, The Coup, came out on, whose album Party Music came out on 9/11, they have this other video called The Guillotine, all based on The Wizard of Oz. And, of course, Emerald City, Seattle. There's your Seattle reference. So the same group has a video pertaining to another city with another major psyop. There's a few other elements to this video, but I'm just showing other examples of how there's this consistent relationship also between 9/11 and 3/11. In fact, if you look at Neo from The Matrix, if you look at his passport, the expiration date and his birth date are worth noting. You have September the 11th is on his passport, and March 11th. Expiration date and birth date. So it seems to me, and people always highlight the 9/11, but they miss the 3/11, which now has a lot more significance. Well, it seemed to me that 9/11 marked the expiration date, and that the New Age, that's kind of what it seems to be hinting at. One other thing, though, about the coup. A famous example of predictive programming with 9/11 is Bart Simpson with the magazine. It has New York, $9, like a ticket, and he's got a coupon. Well, if you look at the building, the buildings, it creates an 11. So it's New York, 9/11, and coupon could be read as coup on. So coup on 9/11, the coup, party music. And of course, he's wearing a red shirt, which could mean something. Like red, as in the red star on the coup's party music, communist, I would guess. I mean, it's not the appropriate word, it's an oversimplification, but when we look at the Great Reset, it is kind of dressed up that way. Environmentalism, sustainability, it's all a cover for what people think of is this equitable system, communism, where everything's equal. But no, I believe it's a way for the elite to gut the wealth of the mobily upward in the middle class. Okay, so let's continue to go forward. I just wanted to point out the consistency of the symbolism and predictive programming across the board. Okay, so we're going through Eyes Wide Shut. Now, a couple things here too. So in Eyes Wide Shut, he gets dropped off at the house where the party's going to happen, and he tears the bill in half, and he hands it to the cab driver. We're talking about Tom Cruise's character. The movie Vanilla Sky, Tom Cruise stars in that one. That movie was #1 in the country, made $100 million, 33 days after 9/11. That movie itself has some scenes reminiscent of locked down New York, as in empty streets. The movie opens up where he has a nightmare that the streets of New York are empty. The movie came out 33 days after 9/11, of course, and he's a 9/11 jumper in a sense. He jumps off the building. That's the whole point of the movie. Not to give you a spoiler, but just a few things that correlate, that tie the two together. All right, so I'm going through chartword.com just to establish here that there are some significant connections between the works of Stanley Kubrick, the Kennedys, 9/11, the space program, and the space program and the death of JFK Jr. But more importantly, I would say that since we now know that Tom Cruise is going to the space station, and there's some kind of a connection between Cruise and JFK Jr. here, I think we might be able to kind of see where this is going. But let's go ahead and get back to the article here, The Broken Presidential Destiny of JFK Jr. There's a couple points I wanted to bring out here. Again, just to reiterate, I think the QAnoners have a point. They're definitely getting the story. I don't think the story is true. And I think there's a disconnect from reality at some point here. But what is pretty obvious is that there is a story that has been told, and it started back, with this JFK Camelot connection, and that's kind of what I wanted to get into. So first, let me look at this. America's Crown Prince. Just so you know where we're coming from, because we don't have royalty here. And that's one of the things this will get into. America's Prince, the JFK Jr. story. It's one of the ways he's been characterized, and that's what we're talking about. Like the subtext, like killing of the king. Well, JFK wasn't the king, he was the president. But the ritual, and I told you about the connections between 9/11, the Rodney King beating, the George Floyd event. Well, it's not a coincidence that Rodney King was beat on the head for 1 minute and 19 seconds, the crown of the head, and that he was hit on the head 33 times. So you look up Rodney King wiki, just a quick fact check here. Officers Wind, Berseno, and Powell attempted numerous strikes on King, resulting in some misses, but with 33 blows. So the 33 hits are what's important. 1 minute 19 seconds, because it's 9/11 backwards. These are just plot points. These are things that they read in the news that go in one ear out the other, and I'm saying these are important clues that show you how integrated the story is. On the 30th anniversary of the Rodney King beating, we had the George Floyd Act passed. George Floyd, of course, was killed 330 days before the conviction date, which was on 4/20. Hitler's birthday, probably not a coincidence. Probably not at all. In fact, I talked about the Lee Harvey Oswald, George Floyd, Derek Chauvin thing, where Chauvin, trial 9/11, when he gets out on bail, it's 11:22 a.m. And then the picture made him look very Oswaldy. Well, Oswald killed a 46-year-old. That's how old JFK was. George Floyd was 46. And if you look at the symbol here now, killing of the king, well, it's the Sun King. The sun set at 8:46 on the date Floyd was asphyxiated for 8:46. Floyd was the Sun King in that ritual. He played the role of Osiris. Osiris dies, when the Prince of Darkness severs his head. There's different ways that the sun god dies, but that's what you witnessed. You witnessed a ritual. The Sun King is pulled in a golden casket, and George Floyd had 4 funerals paid by Floyd Mayweather. He had a golden casket, 4 of them, 4 directions. I mean, it goes deep. The sun god always pulled in a chariot of horses, and then you got George Floyd in a golden casket with horses. Sun King killing ritual. Okay, so let me go ahead and let me add one more point to this. This is another point that I brought up last week. This one here will also, I think, strengthen all of these connections. It has to do with astronaut Lee Harvey Oswald. In other words, there are connections between Oswald and NASA that we have to look at really quick. And it has to do with a place called Riley's Coffee Company. Because to me, this cements it all. So let's say hypothetically that this is all true, just for a moment, that Kubrick directed the fake death of the president. So if that happened, then Kubrick would have been working with Lee Harvey Oswald. So that's kind of the connection. So before Oswald killed the president, he was working at Riley Coffee Company. And this place, Riley's Coffee Company, had several individuals who immediately left to go work for NASA or agencies close to NASA. And around this time, Oswald was communicating that he believed that he was going to go work for NASA. So it's kind of a side note in history. It's like, well, what does that mean? He's going to go work for NASA. Well, it means this. It means that maybe he didn't get the gig to go to the moon. Maybe he was not fit for that, and instead they had him go play this other key role in another JFK-involved production. It also underscores the idea that JFK is not dead. He started the Apollo, he started Vietnam, and all these movies go along with it. So it's a very well integrated story. And just the fact that there's any sort of connection between Oswald and people working at NASA, and then Kubrick, that again can't get much clearer than that. It's very well connected here. We're not conspiracy theorists. So let me go ahead and put that on the map before we get any further. So I'm putting here Kubrick, JFK, and then I'm going to put Lee Harvey Oswald. I'm going to add a separate block here. I'm going to put Riley's Coffee. These are minor points right now, but it's going to build up as I go along and as we stretch this out. And we're going to go ahead and add some characters from the future here. Tom Cruise. And then we're going to people who've been directly connected to Kubrick, and then we'll build from there. I'm going through some comments to see if I've missed anything. Astronaut King says Stanley Kubrick. Interesting. JG says, I think JFK was working behind the scenes on the Apollo show. Enslaved by Truth says Von Braun took out JFK in Houston. Polecat says they're seeing the metascript, but they believe it's real. Scripted and controlled lifting of the veil. Right. Right. The QAnoners are indeed onto a story. Okay, Enslaved says JFK was vocal about Von Braun being full of it. See, I had not heard that. I'd be interested, though. I'd be interested to hear more about that. Someone here says Von Braun appears to have been an actor. Yeah, I think so, too. I think he had a great, I would say he was telegenic, but maybe he was, I would assume he was just an actor. But wasn't he a Nazi? Didn't he have a record? Okay, so let's move on. We're going through an article called The Broken Presidential Destiny of JFK Jr. And this is a side note. I don't want to get too sidetracked, but we've been analyzing these templates. Like 1968 was templated for the summer of, it was used as a template for the summer of 2020 in a number of ways. And the mass media framed it this way. We commented on it. We expanded on it. We made predictions based on it. Monoliths were appearing all over the world last year. Why was that? And again, 2020 has many echoes of several movies that I could talk about. So it's not just Kubrick. This is big. Every bit of predictive programming leads somewhere, and you'll see. We're uncovering this monolithic worldview shaping mechanism. This thing that is disguised as decentralized and competing factions, but no. It's the Tower of Babel. It's truly, truly unified. But not to get too sidetracked, but again, 1968 was very much templated for, or used as a template. In fact, Spike Lee, another metascripter, his movie The Five Bloods had 5 characters kneeling in front of a grave, fist raised, before kneeling became a big thing for BLM. I'm like, wow, how did that happen? The movie was actually set in 68, even though it was a movie about 2020. It kind of went back and forth and is released in 2020. And it involved Chadwick Boseman. I mean, again, other topic, don't want to get too far into it. However, one of the things, like, so for example, in 68, a Kennedy died. That was Robert Kennedy. I think he was 42. In 2020, Trump lost a brother named Robert. Kind of interesting parallel. And people have noticed parallels. Let me go ahead and bring this up really quick. So JFK and Abraham Lincoln. We'll just put down coincidences. Lincoln, Kennedy, coincidences. Just a few of them. And I'm just bringing this up because I want to show you how this is not new. We're looking at, I mean, I'm not a coincidence theorist, and if I was, I would have a lot of work ahead of me, because to me, this is not coincidence. Both Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy were first elected to Congress in 46 and became president in 60. John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln in a theater and ran to a warehouse. Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy from a warehouse and ran to a theater. When Kennedy was shot, the car he was riding in was a Lincoln. Then you have Lincoln. Kennedy slept with Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe was in Some Like It Hot with Jack Lemmon. Jack Lemmon was in JFK, which tells the life story of John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated like Lincoln. John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln in the theater booth. Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy in a motorcade. Again, going through these different, there's a long list. They were both born in, no, some of these are probably questionable. So I'm trying to find the ones that match the most. Both presidents died this, no, that's not it. There's a few other ones here. I think some of these are questionable. That's why I'm kind of trying to gloss over them. It says Lincoln and Kennedy were both succeeded by their vice presidents. Nothing, that's not a coincidence. These are all kind of hit and miss. Let me find the more important one. Because some of these you could kind of just say, well, that is just a coincidence. Both were shot in the presence of their wives. Both were shot in the head. Both were shot on a Friday. Oh, here's one. Both of their successors were named Johnson. What about that? Both of their successors were named Johnson. Both assassins were known by 3 names. John Wilkes Booth, Lee Harvey Oswald. Both assassins were themselves assassinated before their trials. Both were yeah, this is, some of these are somewhat vague. Both men were concerned with civil rights, like very vague, but anyway. I had a better list of these supposed coincidences, but a lot of them have been kind of like, I don't know, there's a point where I kind of don't care to go too deep into it, other than just to show you how there might be inside jokes here, which is one of the things that we're constantly unveiling. Inside jokes, or when you find that the characters have names that tie into the role that they're going to play. Like the name Kennedy, in fact, it's from a Gaelic word, means, it references the head. and he's known for the headshot. And the head is the crown. You know, you talk about the crown within the symbolism and a symbol of a coup, a takeover, taking out the leader by force, or this is all kind of tied together name-wise. Zareth says a week before Lincoln got shot, he was in Monroe, Maryland. And JFK was with Marilyn Monroe. Sure. Yeah, okay. Kennedy means head injury in Scottish. That's what it was. Okay. Kane, Eddie, Eddie being head. Kane to head. Interesting. Well, that would make sense. You know, Rodney King getting hit in the head. All right, let us continue. I'm going through an article about the broken presidential destiny of JFK Jr. because all of this entire thing, I believe we're looking at a long-term, multi-generational psyop. And if it is what it appears to be, we should be in the end days of this script. Okay, so John Jr. was born with the Kennedy presidency precisely 17 days after his dad won the election. So you can see even his birth date ties into 17. And as you'll see, there's a whole lot of 17s, and this is pre-Q. This article, a lot of this material, it's just referencing things. So this Q thing seems to have been possibly written into his life story, and that's my contention here. Cain killed Abel with a head injury, says Zareth the Alchemist. Right, Cain kills Abel with a head injury. And this story, though, of this killing of a king is basically a personification of the death of the day. Night overcoming the sun, the day, the sunlight. The sun dies at sunset, Prince of Darkness set. Of course, it all ties into Saturn and the concept of time. You know, you set your watch. This is all basically a dramatization through the public entertainment and news of these rituals that are personifications of cycles of time. It's a cult that runs the world, and it's a cult that is really centered around time control. And the myth of the phoenix is very important here. That's why dates are important. You know, the phoenix is born again from its ashes. Well, the symbol of the phoenix is actually another way that you can represent Christ, for example. If you look in, this is all very integrated. So let's go into this for a moment. Let's bring up the Christ and the phoenix for just a moment here. There's so many symbols that we could get into. So the phoenix had been used as a Christian symbol for the resurrection since the first ceremony. And again, the 2012, man, I just went over this. And I don't want to spend all day on this, so I'm taking notes. So anything that I find interesting that I can talk about later, I will. But if you watch the 2012 London Olympics, the opening ceremony, they have a Burning Man that becomes a phoenix, no, a corona, and then separately they have a big phoenix. So Burning Man, corona, and phoenix. All of these things tie together in this bigger story, because what is a phoenix but the perfect symbol of a reset? Burn it down, build back better. Well, the World Trade Towers were originally going to be replaced by a World Trade Center Phoenix. Donald Trump was actually part of that proposition. He was actually going to name it that. The Trump Twin Towers, or here it is. This is it. The Twin Towers 2. They had so many different things that were rejected, but they were going to call it the World Trade Center Phoenix. Now, why would they call it that? Well, because you had a ritual, creation to destruction, 33 years, 1968 to 2001. By the way, Kubrick's film Space Odyssey came out in 68. His 9/11 came out in 2001. 33-year creation to destruction ritual. Now, 13 years later, they erect a new tower, the One World Trade Tower, but it's just one tower, and it's 2 into 1. Space Odyssey 2001, 2001. That's kind of encoded into it. Kind of like with Corona, we had Event 201. The two into one is the symbol here. Two towers becoming one. It's about this union of opposites. That's just scratching the surface of some of the interpretation of it here. But the main thing I want to bring up here, because we're talking about the Hegelian dialectic, where you have polarizing sides and you create a new order by slamming them into each other or by having them cancel each other out, put them into conflict. That's what you had with the BLM versus the police. You have Western chauvinism versus this world communist revolution. You have the anti-vaxxers and the pro-vaxxers. These are dialectics they're setting up. The mass media versus the conspiracy theorists. They set these things up as a part of advancing everything forward. You have the thesis, antithesis, and the synthesis. And that's what the Hegelian dialectics are. That's what the black and white Masonic tiles reference. And that's what this was about. The Phoenix is the new order. And they resurrected the new tower. They opened the new tower 13 years later. 13 being the number of resurrection, death and resurrection. It's the cycle. I'm not into numerology, but I've studied it a little bit. Like, you know, the system actually kind of explains itself kind of well. It's self-explanatory. 12 months in a year. The 13th month is the new year. So 13, death of the old year, birth of the new. You look at your clock, you know, after 12, you have the 13th, but instead of 13th, it's just the new one. So it's like a cycle that becomes a spiral. It's advancing forward. So you're looking at a symbolic system where they erect the new towers 13 years after its 33-year creation to destruction. 33, also Christ. Like I said, Christ and Phoenix are synonymous. The new tower, by the way, opened on November the 3rd, 113. Very significant. Again, just shows you the intentionality of the planning here. 1,776 feet tall. Well, 1776, interestingly enough, ties into the Phoenix and Christ. And I'll show you that, how I arrived at that. If you look at, again, I'm not into this stuff, but you kind of have to at least be literate. If you're not symbol literate, the mind control will just work on you flawlessly. You wouldn't have any defense. Your eyes wide open, or eyes wide shut rather. You're a passive receptacle. In Christian numerology, the number 888 represents Jesus. So based on this, the number 1776 has often, you know, you can associate it with the birth of America. It's also the date, the Illuminati, but you could also say this is second coming, 888 times 2, or the rebirth. And again, the Phoenix, Christ, these symbols kind of overlap, but the meaning of the tower's height would pertain, of course, to the rebirth. And this is all the New Age, the one world trade tower. And that's ultimately what we're looking at here. So let us continue. I don't want to get too far into the weeds with these different numbers and rituals, but the 2012 Olympics and all of these Olympics opening ceremonies, all of the Super Bowls tell you the story, as do the movies. I mean, there's so many trails we could go down, but that's why we're keeping this focused. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue. We're talking about the broken presidential destiny of JFK Jr. and the relationship between the Kennedy family, their story, their ritualistic deaths, and metascriptor Stanley Kubrick. Going through comments, see if I've missed anything. Enslaved by Truth says Dealey Plaza is laid out like the tree of life. Zareth says the Kennedy family is allegedly in the bloodlines of the 13 Illuminati families. JFK was deemed to be the king of Camelot. See, there we go. Killing of the king. And killing of the son. And this is all like everybody, no matter what they are into, what genre of entertainment, everybody's going to be exposed to these eternal myths. And it's not because of synchronicity or the universe trying to enlighten us. No, it's because we're in an echo chamber. Even if you think you're not. I mean, what bigger echo chamber could you have than, you know, controlled media with no ability to offer any counter arguments that aren't censored? Like, we're in a global echo chamber. It's what they're creating. And it's getting worse. And they're using the pretext of misinformation as being the new threat to shut it all down. One more comment before we go on further on that, because we're talking about conspiracy theories and how conspiracy theorists are being targeted for extermination, essentially, silencing. They're basically the enemy of the state. Well, JFK's assassination is one of these conspiracy theories that has never gone away. And this article gets into that, into these stories. But I want to point out that conspiracy theories are usually there, planted by the conspirators to prevent you from arriving at the correct conclusions. So you may have heard all the conspiracies about who had shot JFK and why, the magic bullet theory. Maybe you've heard about the Mandela effect for people who don't know how many doors were on the car. You have all these different theories. But the one that you don't hear is the one that specifically talks about the ritualistic murder of the guy. And if you do hear about that one, it's not mainstream. And the one you will never hear that gets close to mainstream is that he never died. They try to keep those stories out, the idea that the whole thing is fake. And so conspiracy theories are generally what I call guard rails. And they're guard rails to keep you from going too far away from the mainstream. I'm over the rails. We went over the rails a long time ago. We have a competing freeway or path. We're keeping up, we're observing, but I am not being caught up in any of these stories. But I recognize these stories exist. It's too easy to look at the group of nonconformists and just say, oh, well, they're not mainstream. You can't trust them. Oh, you can't trust them. They're conspiracy theorists. Well, that's a kind of ignorance that I just can't really abide by. And the people who live like that, when they call in, occasionally we get people call in. I'm like, okay, well, I know where you're coming from, and I don't envy you. I would rather know how bad I'm being lied to than have a false sense of certainty and live by it, and cudgel people over the head with it, like I know better. Media is not source. And I have plans. We have plans for the future. I think there's quite a lot we can do here with this topic of conversation. But I have some plans for some very interesting debates and conversations in the future we'll get into later. And if you're involved in our Discord channel, you'll be the first to know. So let's go ahead and move on. We're talking about John F. Kennedy Jr. Now, here's where this is where it actually kind of involves me personally. And this is the reason why I'm doing this. In 1995, John F. Kennedy Jr. launched his political magazine, George. Under the appearance of superficiality, it engaged in controversial issues of deep politics that reflected his interests. Now, many QAnoners have noticed some predictive programming in George magazine, referencing Bill Gates, injections, Corona, all kinds of stuff. Donald Trump. I mean, there's a few things in here. But he starts this magazine called George so that he could get into, like his father was in journalism. And remember, Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, Joker was a journalist, and he was representing JFK. And JFK started the war. So we're looking at his son becoming a journalist and then using this to interact with politics so he could get into it. All right, so his interest for the presidency transpired heavily in George, especially in the reoccurrence section, "If I Were President." So this gets into the talk about his future ambitions, the likelihood that he would have succeeded, and the role the Clintons may have had in blowing up his plane. And that's kind of where this goes. Caption here, Donald Trump and John Kennedy Jr., 1999. Says here, I think he would have run for, this is a comment from Rosemary Terrazio, recounts that when New York Senator Al D'Amato suggested that Kennedy should run for mayor, he laughed it off. But later he said, how many mayors do you know become president? That's not the road you go down. Another statement he said, or it was said that he would have run for president in 2008 or 2016. He would have been 56. I mean, this is all possibly speculation. JFK Jr. mulled a run for Senate in 2000. So this is where it put him in Hillary Clinton's way. It says, John was convinced his best shot at running for the Senate seat was Monahan's seat. Hillary Clinton had hesitated to enter because she feared John. At that time, he was heir to the Kennedy magic, and he was People's Magazine's sexiest man alive, and a consummate New Yorker. That was something else. She was not a New Yorker, so she would have been seen as a carpetbagger. Now, this article goes on about his aspirations, more about his magazine, and I think we even have something here where he supposedly said that he was going to leave the magazine behind in favor of running for office. Now, let's move on a little further. JFK Jr. as the conspiracy theorist. How dedicated was he to getting to the bottom of his father's assassination? So now, here's where we get to the distinction between our view, our assessment, and the world stage assessment. So this is all predicated on the reality where, or the world, the universe where JFK Jr. died. We may know it's all scripted, as evidenced by Kubrick's involvement, but we have to just follow the story because this starts Q. This is where Q comes from. Going through some comments before we go any further. Logo says, adrenochrome is not funny. You can't. Oh yeah. Well, adrenochrome is also a hoax, by the way. The whole adrenochrome storyline, I think, is a big hoax. There's no evidence for it, but that's part of the story. Or maybe it's not a hoax. I mean, we're going to find out, aren't we? That's kind of what this whole thing is about. And also, if you're offended by jokes, what are you doing on the internet? Like, I joke about adrenochrome all the damn time. If you really care about the truth getting out, wouldn't you want the public to have an idea of what it is that we're joking about? Or would you rather we keep it somber? Or that we get frantic and start panicking and start screaming, oh, they're going to drink your adrenochrome. I mean, I don't think it's that simple. But yeah, there's plenty there. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about this. Lady Gaga, who sang the inauguration for hologram in Chief Biden, dressed up. She's dressed up like someone out of the Hunger Games. She's got the Phoenix reset symbol, the dove with the olive branch on her chest. Anyway, months before that, she was performing a song on a piano that was designed to look like a giant brain. She's wearing Freddy Krueger gloves with blades. And the room is lit all purple, and she's got this mask with this glowing, like, grill. So it looked like, and the song was called Chromatic, like adrenochromatic. So I'm like, all right, she's probably referencing it. Logo says, you don't know. Well, you know, if you want to call in and let us know what you know, please do. Otherwise, we're just going to assume that you're an internet Karen, mad that we don't share your points of view. Like, I'm not afraid of what you're afraid of. Like, how dare us? Like little Greta. How dare you? You don't know about my climate change. All right, let us go ahead and continue. We're talking about JFK Jr. and his interest in the conspiracy theories about his father's assassination. According to testimonies from his friends, John Jr. was haunted by... Oh, wait, one more thing. Let me add one more thing. If there's anything at all that would debunk the idea that the elite are drinking this magical substance that makes them immortal or whatever, look at them. Look at all the adrenochrome junkies and look how poorly they've aged. I don't see any evidence of any of these people imbibing anything healthy at all. And moreover, it's ridiculous to say that only the left wing, only the Democrats, only the Hollywood liberals do it, but the other guys don't. Like, I'm sorry, it's just not that simple. Life isn't that simple. We're looking at a very complex alternate reality game that has been here since before any of us here were probably born. I mean, I'm certain of it, actually, because what we have now is just the newer iteration. They've replaced the religions, and we're in a new religion. It's a global one. It's been imposed on us, and it's still not quite complete, but they're getting there. They've reintroduced eschatology. They've reintroduced sin, original sin, the expiation of sin through confessional recycling. The one thing they haven't brought back yet that's coming, and it's in my book, is your new Christ. Wait until you see that. Okay, so let us go ahead and continue. We're talking about JFK Jr. and his interest in his dad's death and the conspiracies about it. Again, this is an article from alethonews.com. Okay. Here we have a couple of pieces. It does suggest here, it says, as many truth seekers who had started the Kennedy assassination, John had developed an awareness that other events of great historical consequence were the subject of state orchestrated lies and cover-ups with corporate media complicity. And so the JFK assassination was not the only conspiracy issue explored by George Magazine. He delved into the theory that TWA Flight 800, which had exploded on July 17, 1996, soon after leaving JFK International, had been downed by a missile. So he had explored that conspiracy theory. And that one kind of comes back later because, of course, there's a conspiracy theory that his own plane was shot down. Now let's move forward. Going back, I want to get to the end of this article. Again, we're just kind of establishing here that there's a storyline, and the storyline here connects with his father and even other family members, but it's about their family. So it says, so was JFK Jr. himself assassinated? Here's the man whose road to the presidency seemed traced. No other man of his age had a better chance to reach the White House one day, and no other man in the world would want the 1963 Kennedy assassination reinvestigated. He was already trying to educate the public through his magazine, something no other Kennedy had done. Even RFK kept his doubts on the Warren report private. So it suggests that he kind of downplayed, but he was trying to get it out there. Now it says, what are the odds that he would die at that precise moment by accident? How lucky for his enemies to be spared the trouble of eliminating him, as they did his uncle in '68. If that was an accident, then that alone deserves to be called the Kennedy curse. It says even, now there's more here. It says, there's a book here, Sons of Camelot. Now, Sons of Camelot, this book kind of goes into building this myth, and that's the main thing here. The main thing I want to get at here is that we're looking at this mythologizing of this celebrity family, this political family, where they've turned him into this royal family, which is absurd, but again, we're talking about stories because we don't have a king here, but the QAnoners are in fact waiting for one. A bond of blood and spirit of a comparable nature existed between John F. Kennedy and the son that bore his name. Although John Jr. could not speak with his father or remember speaking to him, his loyalty was nurtured by his mother, who was the driving force in his life. From the point of view of JFK's murders, JFK Jr. was JFK and RFK at the same time. All three were like one man who had been killed 3 times. So this is kind of the story they've created here. The author asks, was Kennedy assassinated? The evidence may not be absolutely compelling, but what can be proven beyond reasonable doubt is that federal authorities and corporate media engaged in a cover-up of any of the facts that contradicted the theory of the accident due to pilot error. And that's the main thing I want to get to here before we moved on. That there are doubts as to whether or not it was just an accident, and there are witness accounts who claim they saw an explosion. And this is the most likely thing to me, that this is, of course, a staged death with a guardrailed conspiracy. Oh, was he shot down or was it a real crash? Both of those conspiracies end with him dead. And I'm suggesting that his death was entirely faked. This article goes in to debunk the idea that he was entirely inexperienced or reckless. And then something else. The Kennedy crash site footage disappeared. 8 hours of video footage taken by recovery divers was taken by the Navy, and the Navy destroyed them. So that's another aspect to this. Now, there's something else here. The rushed autopsies. These autopsies were performed very quickly. They were taken to the hospital Wednesday night, 7:15 p.m., and released at 11 p.m., according to the medical examiner's office. Many jurisdictions refuse autopsies at night. The haste in this case could lead to questions about the thoroughness of the investigation. You can't do 3 investigations in 4 hours. The author goes on, to me, the most suspicious thing of all is the way the bodies were disposed after their autopsies. They were cremated in Duxbury's Cemetery crematorium, and the remains were taken to the Navy destroyer Briscoe and scattered to the sea near the place where they had died. Says, why the burial for the 35th president's son was carried out in keeping with his expressed wishes. They wanted a burial at sea. That's the reason why, they say. But someone else, the article goes on to say this is not typical. Know whether Kennedys had been cremated, and that why would somebody at the age of 39 have made that wish expressly clear? Okay, I'm going to move on from that piece. Again, if you have anything to add, go ahead and put it in the chat. What we're mainly getting out here now is that if you're going down this route, looking at the bigger story, then you have to admit that there's a scripter. A lot of people say these are coincidences and that we're privy to it, that it's God, that we're looking at synchronicity, and I'm not willing to stop there. I think that's too simple an explanation, and I think the most likely explanation is that there are human agency. There's a human agency involved here. There's a deliberate, concerted effort to build up a mythos here, and this is where it leads now. So we touched on all these different bits where Kubrick's films are reaching into the future, telling us or foreshadowing the future. And I do think that there's quite a lot that has to do with what happens in outer space, this space odyssey story, and it continues with Tom Cruise. But the thing that I wasn't really expecting was this QAnon connection. But we have studied Donald Trump in depth, and he's a very, I would say he's a very scripted character as well. You can find many examples of Donald Trump and the instances where he seems to be indicated in various movies. I would point out the Trump 58 Matrix for one example. There's a few other things. The 58 thing is just how often that date or that number is involved in his life, in his the various transformative events, to the point where, you know, once is happenstance, twice is coincidence, 3 times, 4 times. You begin to see intentionality here. There are other coincidences having to do with the birthday of the president and when he took office. And without going into all of those, I'm suggesting that the only way these things are possible is if it was written that way. Things don't happen that way by coincidence. There would have to be some level of staging, which again is very consistent with this entire concept of ritual tied to the celestial realm. You know, stars, the sun, the moon, the planets, all being part of these rituals. In fact, a lot of these are personifications of the celestial bodies, which we can touch on here. But I want to take a short break. It's been about an hour and a half. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on over to Infinite Plane Radio. We'll see what's playing there. We'll be back in 15 minutes, and then we're going to get up to the present time, JFK Jr., where he is right now, and how it relates to the big story. So I'll be back shortly. Q identified and JFK Jr.'s staged death revealed. And this cannot be properly understood without accounting for the role of Stanley Kubrick and his work on the metascript, on the shaping of these psychological operations. And of course, people who are only mainstream won't accept anything that involves the fake deaths. And then you have people who are willing to accept that JFK Jr.'s death was faked, but they assume that JFK's death was real. So my observations are all I can go off of. I have no evidence other than what's been presented, and the story and the scripting suggests that no, we're looking at theater A to Z. So I have no reason to think we're looking at actual deaths in any of these. So let's go ahead and jump now to right now. Right now, QAnon is not really dropping anything in the old format, which was on the chans, the boards. Most of those had been kind of shut down. They've been branded as hate sites. And if you go over there, they're just ugly sites. And they're full of a bunch of incels and Nazis and the like. But these days, QAnon is now posting at George News. And that's my main point here. And I can prove it. But the fact is that the individual or individuals behind QAnon, including this JFK Jr. character, they're operating behind JFK Jr.'s magazine. So first, let's look at George magazine. Okay, George, not just politics as usual. Now, this is a pretty popular site, and now I want to show you a couple related sites. So here's the Telegram tree. First link, here's the Telegram account. I'm sorry, it's a link tree. This shows all the different links where you can find George magazine. So it's a news magazine, and it's one of the top performing news sites on Paperly. I know this because I spoke to the CEO of Paperly, and I was told that, yeah, George News is their top performing site. And this platform is run by an individual who is believed by QAnoners to be John F. Kennedy Jr. My personal experience has revealed to me that no, this is actually run by somebody who's obviously close to this John F. Kennedy Jr., but no, this is actually run by an individual who will be getting into, an actor. But 249,000 subscribers on Telegram. I would say that this is the biggest channel associated with Trump personally and the people around him. I'm talking George News was actually there at his birthday party last month, recording happy birthday with a phone. They're in the same building, as you'll see. I've established all of this. So George News is the real mask of QAnon, and it's the major voice for Trump to get his information out. And all of Trump's statements come out through this outlet. And the numbers, you can see, they are reaching, and you can see exactly what people's views are towards this George character. So like right now, for example, this is George, and he's in, I don't know where exactly, probably the White House, and he has a secret document, U.S. Senate Committee, Homeland Security, Government Affairs, page 17. And what he's constantly doing is he's constantly showing us clips. Sometimes he's inside of a military plane. Sometimes he's with the Trumps. He's in Trump Tower, constantly revealing his closeness to the Trumps. And he's been using the YouTube chat in order to communicate from JFK Jr. to the QAnoners. So go to youtube.com/ just on your own time, Anonymous Q. And this is where we'll start. youtube.com/ Anonymous Q. That link will take you to one of George News's channels. This is the platform that is used for Trump to reach his QAnoners, despite all the media censorship. And this is where my connection to this whole situation comes into play. Because whoever is behind managing these YouTube channels and all this content, this person works for YouTube. They have access. They're a Google moderator. The way I came into this is like this. The person who operates George, and here on YouTube has 151,000 subs, and you can look at their chat logs where he just plays old Trump videos and responds to the live chats. And I'll let you hear some of the chats just so you know. Like Trump won, the world's watching, we love you, George. And as you'll see, it gets into straight up hero worship for their returning king, their returning prince. And we'll get into all of these. But, okay, so here's where my connection to George Magazine comes in. So I was getting censored quite a lot on YouTube in 2017, 2018. And there was a point where Google moderators were deleting comments. So after my 60th channel that I had shut down on YouTube, because somebody was filing DMCAs, these digital copyright millennium. Let me get the DMCA title for you. It's the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. So this was basically a way to shut me down on YouTube. Somebody was claiming that they owned copyrights to my videos. Hundreds of these were filed. So the person filing it was doing it just as a way to harass me. And then, of course, they were doing it through proxies, not using their real name. So it's all just what you would call perjury. You know, it's an act of perjury to file a false DMCA claim against somebody. But this was being done systematically until I sued YouTube. Now, I sued them in small claims just to get their attention, and I got their attorney on the phone. So I never went after a settlement. I knew I wouldn't win because I wasn't even in their jurisdiction, but I wanted their attention, and I got it. And I explained to them that somebody was exploiting this loophole, and I gave them a spreadsheet with every one of these channels and the associated complaints and the takedown dates. And what they did was they actually ended up banning the individual, restored some of my channels, and in the process, through a subpoena, I was able to ascertain the identity of the individual who was shutting my channel down. Now, at the time, he went by the name MGTV Truth. The channel doesn't really exist anymore because of my lawsuit. They had actually shut him down. Now, here's the thing. This person obviously had some deep access to YouTube. So here he is mentioned in an article. David Hogg is not a crisis actor. This is from BTR Today. So it talks about this. If you remember the Parkland shooting, when that happened, it says here, a video from MGTV, a YouTube channel, which usually posts videos about pedophile rings, flat earth, and other conspiracies. It had a copy of a David Hogg news report that had picked up hundreds of thousands of views and comments before it was removed by YouTube for violating its policy on bullying. MGTV implored his users or viewers to copy it to their own channels. So this article is about MGTV Truth. So this channel had taken the David Hogg video as an actor and caused it to go viral. Now let me go and get into this for a moment because it ties into everything here. Because the CEO of YouTube couldn't figure out how it went viral. That was the problem. They said, how did this video that wasn't, look, it says here, crisis act, this is from February 20th, 2018. Crisis actor YouTube video removed after it tops their trending videos. So they couldn't figure it out. YouTube had to apologize. They said this video, since deleted, somehow went straight to the top of YouTube's trending, a popular spot for users to check out what's trending. Their CEO said in a statement, this video should not have appeared in trending. It was noticed by Motherboard 3 hours after its publication. It had picked up more than 200,000 views, and it called David Hogg an actor paid for by George Soros. So the crisis actor conspiracy theories, yeah, it started with more like Sandy Hook, but it went mainstream with Parkland. And it went mainstream because the top video was doxing Hogg as a crisis actor. My point being, in several articles, it was found that they couldn't figure out how this video had hijacked their system. Well, I know from observations that whoever this MGTV is, and we used to watch this, he had a way of gaming YouTube's system. In fact, he would post, we have postings, I have analytics where he would brag about the success of his channel. So it's, by all indications, this person seems to have some kind of deep connection there, and he gamed the system, and his video actually trumped CNN's source video for that. So let's continue. I'm bringing this up because this is someone who worked, this is how I got his information. The person who made David Hogg popular, a household name as a crisis actor, is a person that I had to sue as a co-defendant when I sued YouTube. And that's how I got his information. And this is where I obtained the email address, I'll go through some of these, like anonymouscharity@gmail and some others. And this is where I also found that he was starting this new operation called George, and he had moved away from pushing deep state. In fact, the whole story of the deep state and pedophile, cannibal, conspiracy theorists, it came from this individual. He was one of the main disseminators of this. It's called Bloodlines of the Illuminati, the History of the Deep State. And it was promulgated by a Guy Fawkes mask wearing anonymous person, one of these anons. So this is where QAnon comes into the picture. How this anonymous character became a right-wing thing and then started to release the information about the deep state and the war on the deep state. So let's jump into this. So this is from How I Learned the Identity of QAnon. Now let me show you an example. YouTube.com/anonymousQ, like I said, takes you to George News now because he used to go by Anonymous. He used to go by Anonymous Q. And then it switched to George when Trump got into office. So if you remember, there was this leaked picture of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was dancing on a roof of a building in college. And they did this video was released to make her look bad. And it kind of backfired. There's a 30-second video. This is from USA Today, I believe. Uploaded by Anonymous Q. So he's a political operative. And Anonymous Q has made waves already because he's kind of an insider. And as you'll find, in fact, let me just take you there right away. This channel is DC and New York based. They're state, Department of Defense, and White House credentialed. He works with the White House Communications Agency. And as we'll go into this, you'll see how deeply connected this person is. And I'll back all my statements, but the long and short of it is he works directly for Donald J. Trump. He knows Ivanka and Don Jr. He stays at the Trump hotels, the towers. So he has been with Trump since 2016, 2017, possibly before. And as we'll get into his history, I think it's before. And I think the connection started with that reality TV show, The Apprentice, because we're talking about an actor. And this actor, and I don't want to get shut down for doxing or anything like that, but his brother works for Pat Robertson. We're talking about a family with a very, very wealthy family. But anyway, his connection to Trump preceded Trump getting into office. And what's more, and I have evidence for this as well, the person I'm talking about is personally acquainted with Joe Rogan, for example, Alex Jones. So you find he's moving in these circles. And there's an episode of Joe Rogan that was pulled from Spotify, episode 911, where this individual is actually there with Eddie Bravo and Alex Jones, but he refuses to go on camera. But again, we'll get to that here. Okay, so Trump was behind QAnon from the beginning. Now, I talked recently, I had an interview, I spoke with Mike Rothschild, the author of QAnon, The Storm, and he believes that Trump has plausible deniability. He maintained that. And I asked a couple of times, I'm like, how can you say he has no plausible deniability when he hasn't just come out and condemned it? He has done the opposite, in fact. So if I'm right about this, and I am, then it logically follows that Trump has been behind QAnon from the beginning. And this is why it's so critical to get that QAnon, whoever this is, it's centered around the story of JFK Jr.'s revenge against the deep state. So it's a psychological operation. It's an alternate reality game. It's a prophecy cult. It's come to represent the new face of anti-mainstream media sentiment. But so right now, let's start with this. Again, George News, John Kennedy's magazine, Not Just Politics, has been taken over, and it's run by this individual from the White House Communications Office, MGTV. Real name is Marcus Goldfinch. So he's spent Trump's entire term shadowing Trump around, taking pictures. He's there with the first family, always there, basically documenting it and putting out daily press releases. And they've got this George thing. This George magazine is their media outlet. He has extensive videos with access to military operations. During COVID, he was on the Mercy ship. He's clearly got access to all these individuals. Vice President Mike Pence gave Marcus Goldfinch and George News a personalized set of suit cuff links. So, again, we're talking about someone with the White House Communications Office who, by the way, was part of the anonymous hackers, these white hat hackers. Where do you think the white hat thing comes from? White hats are fighting for you. Anonymous are the white hats. And so he's been with the Anonymous since 2008. His former names, and you may have, if you followed QAnon from the beginning, you'll have recognized these names. These are all his accounts. Anonymous Q, FBI Anon, QAnon. These are the ones that originally started releasing this information. The Q drops were done from these particular channels. He was in the anonymous movement, White House hacker. Now he works with RF Kennedy Jr. and the Trumps. He's at Mar-a-Lago a lot of the time. So a little background on him, and we'll get deeper into it, but he's independently wealthy, I believe. I'm not sure how much is inherited, but he was part of a deal in 2005. He was a part owner of Myoplex, EAS Myoplex. This is the nutrition product. So he was a part owner of this company, and when it sold to Abbott Labs, he walked away with a chunk of $300 million. He's an actor and a stuntman. He's credited with being in Fast and the Furious, Power Rangers, the Xena, the Warrior Princess. So these are a couple of things I wanted to bring up, just because it's relevant here to bring up his full bio, his background in movies, because we're talking about somebody who's already in the entertainment. So if we're talking about actors, like think about Lee Harvey Oswald. You're talking about somebody who's given a role on the world stage. So my contention here, and listen to the movies that he was in. I don't know how many of these have predictive programming or are part of this big script, but Marcus was in Hercules, The Legend Continues from 1995 to 99, Xena, the Warrior Princess, 95 to 99, Lord of the Rings, King Kong. Let's see here. He travels between Auckland and Samoa. There's plenty of others that haven't been mentioned here. It almost looks like, now that I think about it, it looks like he's actually been scrubbing his own IMDb. Yes, he actually has scrubbed it. Doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me at all. I have it all saved, but look, I've been planning to do this expose for a little while, but we'll see what else I can find on here that you might recognize. My point being here is that you have somebody who's been in television and in big movies since the 90s. In fact, he was the body double for the Red Power Ranger, which is a side note here, but kind of a funny story, because the Red Power Ranger character, there's sort of a curse behind it. So one of the Power Rangers, they call it the Power Rangers death curse. And this guy was the Red Power Ranger. He was like the guy who did the actual fighting for it. Wasn't the spoken words actor, but he was the fighter. So we know he can fight. He could fight like a Power Ranger. I hope I never meet him. So this individual did body double work for the red guy who, the first one, killed his roommate with a samurai sword. The second one, I think he beat his family nearly to death and then killed himself. The third one had, I think he had kidnapped an older couple, slit their throats, stolen their boat, and was caught with a case of cash. I mean, all of these Red Power Rangers came to really bad ends. Just a side note. But we're talking about an actor with a very extensive background, very diverse. So now, anyway, let's move forward. Now this is something that's kind of noteworthy because we're talking about conspiracies. And so he's been involved in all these same circles. Like, that you got the Kennedys. Let me bring this one up. RFK Jr. Because a lot of them are very involved in politics, in like political football. So Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is really big with anti-vax. So that's kind of a interesting point because the anti-vax conspiracy overlaps with a lot of other things. This MGTV or Marcus Goldfinch character, actually he had a production company called MGTV World, and he and Eric Dubay, the flat earther, had actually released something on Amazon together. I'll pull that up for you. I believe it was called The Awakening. I think it might have been, it was either The Awakening. Yes. Yes. Now imagine that, The Awakening. Think about the terminology here. The Great Awakening. Watch The Awakening. Producers, MGTV, Studio, MGTV World, Eric Dubé. Just bringing this up. The Awakening, A True Story, 2017, read by Eric Dubé, and this is produced by QAnon, Marcus Goldfinch. Big conspiracy theorist. Eric Dubé is an anti-vaxxer who was actually vax damaged, and that's how he moved to Thailand with a big settlement. You could find the actual court paperwork. So and there's more connections between the top echelon flat earthers who held the conferences and this Marcus Goldfinch character from New Zealand, this actor. But let us continue. His Twitter account, The Collective Q, has since been taken down. Okay, here's one. His email address, anonymouscharity@gmail.com, actually turns up. It was used in Trump's term at the White House Communications Office Dropbox. So if you wanted to get pictures of Trump, videos of Trump, you'd watch the speeches, you could go to the White House's Dropbox. And the email address that was being used for a lot of that was anonymouscharity@gmail. Anonymous Charity is one of the emails attributed to this individual that was revealed to me in that subpoena. So, I mean, it is a fact that Marcus Goldfinch is part of this QAnon psyop, and that he was on episode 911 at the Joe Rogan podcast at the intro, and 25 minutes in, Alex Jones mentions him. He mentions, quote, Q's travels in the UAE, which is where he is now. Okay, now let's get into this. Marcus was given a White House key from Vice President Pence and cufflinks. So I have pictures of that. In fact, let me bring up a picture of the White House key so you can see what that looks like. Okay, so this is, you can see on the computer here, you have a sticker. It's a bumper sticker advertising George Magazine, not politics as usual. And then over here you have his phone. And I have screen caps of email exchanges between Marcus Goldfinch and Ivanka Trump. You can't read the emails, but I saw the headline in one of them. So he's dropping hints here and there so that the QAnoners know that he's got access. And so when he says JFK Jr. is coming back, they believe it. And that's where the story's going. So here's a key to the White House. I saw one of these. They were out of stock. I tried to buy one online just to see what they were worth. It was like $2,500. So President Donald J. Trump gave him this key. And so my point is this. You've got a major league conspiracy theorist who published Bloodlines, the Illuminati, the Deep State's history. He's been pushing conspiracy theories, flat earth conspiracies. He made David Hogg the most famous crisis actor in the world. And he gets a key from the president. And I sued the guy, and I'm still suing him over trademark disputes because, and look, let me bring this up, because the reason why I'm doing this today instead of taking calls and having a lot of fun is that I'm working on a few projects, and one of them is I'm trying to get my art auction site going. And so this individual is a cyber squatter, and he purchased a lot of domains to take away from my channel, even as he was censoring my channel. And I don't like to list the domains because I don't want to draw attention to it. However, like timosman.com, he purchased it and he redirected it to a clone YouTube account. He's done this for 4 years now, almost 3.5 years. No, I guess it'll be 3 years with this one. He's been doing various things to harass myself and the channel and all this stuff. Well, the other day he repurchased about 15 domains that would all direct traffic towards what I'm doing. So for example, I was buying timosman.art because he had let it lapse, and I was given the option to bid on it. And within an hour of me bidding on it, he repurchased it. Now, cyber squatting is a form of property crime. And in fact, if you look up Tim Osman trademark dispute, you'll probably find a few articles about my filing against this unnamed cyber squatter. Because at the very beginning, I didn't know who he was. And that's one of my points here. I didn't know who this John Doe was. It took this case to get his docs because I was able to leverage the power of the court to get information from Google and PayPal and a few others. Because he had opened up a fake timosmond.com PayPal account and he was soliciting donations, wire fraud, by the way. I mean, he's committed a lot of crimes. Even, look, if I had an estimate done on my case against him, which I'm having to refile, and it's getting bigger this time, but treble damages for the number of registered, I'm talking maliciously, bad faith domain registrations, it could easily cross into $250,000. And that's not even getting into the civil. So he's done. That my motivation here is to drag him into the light and get some left-wing MSM rag like the Daily Beast or the Daily Dot to do an expose, because this guy's so close to Trump. He's the most radicalizing factor in Trump's circle. And if this doesn't get media attention, then this whole thing is just rigged. But personally, I think this is a big story. And the sooner he gets roasted, the sooner I can serve him papers. So there's a pot of gold at the end of this for me. So by all means, I want this to get out. Let us go ahead and continue. We're talking about the role of JFK Jr. in QAnon and JFK Jr.'s magazine being run by the guy that popularized David Hogg, somebody that I happened to sue over something unrelated, which gave me a little bit of information, a little too much, to where I can actually I have unraveled the whole thing. Anyway, QAnon identified JFK Jr.'s staged death revealed. And the big reveal here is that it's all real. The QAnon story is there. They're not making it up. The only question is, who wrote it and how far are they taking this? And if it goes where the script says it's going, you should be expecting tribunals, mass executions of Democrats and celebrities, and all of the facts and truth about the matter that you would ever want will be on your TV 24/7, whether or not you want to see it, because Trump's emergency broadcast is going to take over, and it's going to be global. That's the Great Awakening that they've described. That's the story. So make of it what you will. I'm going to follow it closely. There are so many different trails we could have gone through here, but like I said, I wanted to keep this focus on one thing, that this is a real story, that JFK Jr. is a major player. His magazine, for 3.5 years now, has been a major platform for this movement, and it's personally connected to Trump. He has zero plausible deniability. QAnon is high up in the White House, and the media has yet to tackle this topic.
Happen if the world were a little bit different?